Good afternoon, everybody. It's now 2 o'clock. Welcome to the meeting of the Environment and Transport Committee today. Can I remind everybody that the meeting is broadcast live via the County Council's website and will be available for viewing later. Can everybody therefore please switch on their microphones when they begin to speak, and please don't forget to turn them off again when you finish speaking. Could I also ask everybody to turn their mobile phones to silent, please? I received apologies from Mr. Pearson, who went home rather ill at lunchtime, and at fairly short notice, Mr. Jennings is substituting for him. Mrs. Posnett, the Cabinet Lead Member for the Environment and Passenger Transport, is also unable to join us today, so we welcome Mrs. Radford, Cabinet Support Member for that department. So can we go straight on to item 1 on the agenda? I propose that the minutes of the meeting held on the 22nd of November are taken as read, as confirmed and signed. Is everybody agreed? I'll do that. Thank you. Question time. I've received no questions. Questions asked by members under Standing Orders 7.3 and 7.5. I've received none of those. There are no urgent items. Can I move on to declarations of interest in respect of items on the agenda today? Mr. Payne.
Chairman, many thanks. As per usual, given that I'm a non-exec director of a taxi company in Leicestershire, I will declare an interest due to the nature of the business in item 9, and therefore will not be in attendance for that meeting, part of the meeting. In terms of item 8, the medium-term financial strategy, given that the functions of the department are split between transportation and passenger transportation and waste and highways delivery models, etc., which I am responsible for, I will stay in the meeting to answer questions relating to functions under my responsibility. However, I'll take no part in any of the discussion or debate around passenger transportation issues that may arise.
Thank you. Anybody else? No, thank you. I can just confirm that following discussions with the monitoring officer, and given the exceptional nature of the meeting today, and with a view to avoid Mr. Payne having to leave the meeting repeatedly, it's proposed that Mr. Payne will remain in the room but not participate on passenger transportation matters. However, if the debate appears to be contentious and is likely to lead to any vote, then I would ask Mr. Payne to leave. Thank you. Item 6 on the agenda. Does any party whip declarations to be made? No. And item 7 on the agenda is petitions. Have any petitions been presented? Thank you, Mo. So the first substantial item on the agenda this afternoon is the medium-term financial strategy. This is set out in pages 17 to 42 in your pack. Members should also have a copy, a buff-papered copy, on the process of suggested process of dealing with budget proposals. The director responsible will go through her presentation, and I intend to deal with matters in the order on the buff paper so that there isn't a lot of going backwards and forwards through the agenda, and everybody can concentrate on items in the small section so that the director and her assistants can deal with that. I also welcome to the meeting, as we've just seen, Mr. Payne, who's Cabinet Lead Member for Highways, Strategic Transportation and Waste, and Mrs. Radford, who is the support member. Mr. Rhodes is the portfolio holder for Finance and Resources, who is also here to help us with our questions. Anne Carruthers, the Director of Environment and Transport, will present the report, and Nick Walsh from Corporate Resources also joins to assist us in answering questions. Welcome to you both. So, I would like to invite the Director of Transport and Environment to begin her presentation.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. Overall, just to give you the brief overview for the impacts of the medium-term financial strategy for the Environment and Waste Department, I just draw your attention to the fact that the Department has already to date, from 2010-11, saved £43 million of savings. And that is part of the wider £178 million saved by the Council in totality. We, however, going forward, still have a target of a further 7.1 million to make by 21-22. Taking the report, as the Chair has already outlined in stages, I propose to give you a broad overview and the highlights of the revenue budget for the Department. So taking you to Table 2 on page 19, you can see the overview of the revenue budget for across all the service areas in environment and transport. And that totals just over 62 million for the 18-19 financial year. Within that, however, we do have a number of growth items whereby, obviously, because of demands on services, we foresee existing budgets won't be sufficient, and we have allocated and highlighted that they have growth around them. On page 20, we start to go through those, and I would just pick out for you the special education needs transport budget category there. Traditionally, we have seen growth of between 4 and 9% annually on that budget, and that table there, or the bar chart there shows the increase in average daily cost per user, SEN user. So as you can see, over time, it's consistently going up. What we're actually seeing is not particularly increases in numbers, but we're seeing increases in complexity of the clients and the passengers we're carrying. Therefore, the requirements and needs in terms of either sorry, I've forgotten the word. Escorts is what I was looking for, as well as solo transport, etc., like that. That actually increases our costs there, and that trend has been continuing, and we see no reason, unfortunately, why that will desist. Therefore, we've notified a growth pressure there. In terms of the environment and waste side, the waste tonnage increases, the top of page 21. Again, I mean, you'll be fully aware this is a budget we have to react to because we have to deal with the waste that's generated. We have had an underspend in previous years, therefore we're not forecasting growth in 18-19. But from 19 onwards we are, and we have set that at 1%, and we think that's a prudent level to set that at. There's a whole host of factors that come into play when we see growth there: demographics, population growth, behaviours, etc. But we feel 1% is prudent. But as you can see from that, by 2021, that totals 880,000, so quite significant growth. Moving on to the savings then that are in the MTFS for us and are currently in train within the Department. The ones I would pick out for you in terms of the highways and transport side of activities is that revised approach to highways activities, ET2. There are a whole host of initiatives under this one. Restructures, service reviews to drive efficiencies, increasing productivity, maximising sources of income. So as I say, there is a whole host of different initiatives that lie under that to equate to that 550,000 that you see in 2018-19. Over the page, in page 22, I will pick out for you ET4, which is the revised passenger transport policy. This is looking at our subsidised bus, our current subsidised bus arrangements. And what we're currently doing is working on a proposed policy for passenger transport, which we would then apply to those services. You may be aware that under government legislation, we're required to provide transport to meet essential needs for travel where the commercial market doesn't do this. However, unfortunately, the legislation doesn't go far enough as to define essential. And obviously, as a public authority, we would also want to ensure we have value for money in what we are attributing to that service area. Therefore, the work is currently looking at how we, as Leicestershire County Council, would want to interpret that essential and also value for money. What the next steps in that work will be to go to Cabinet in March to propose a draft policy to go to consultation. Depending on what that policy finally looks like, we would then apply that to our existing subsidised services, and that links into the following paper on the agenda this afternoon of our community bus partnerships. So there'll be more discussion, no doubt, there. Moving on, we are reviewing social care and SEN transport, which the Scrutiny Committee is fully aware of because we previously brought a report at the end of last year about proposed changes there. That consultation has closed, and we will be taking the results of that to Cabinet in March, and obviously await a decision as to how that will go forward. Under the savings that are being taken forward by the department, the one again I would pick out for you is the county-wide parking strategy. This is, as members know, this is looking at the feasibility or the business case for on-street parking charges within the county. We are currently augmenting previous work on the business case to ensure it is robust, and we felt that further work was needed on that before we bring forward proposals that will go both through Scrutiny and Cabinet as they are worked up and developed. The implementing alternative fleet provision, the one underneath, that again relates back to our SEN and social care transport, and that is looking at our most high cost contracts we have at the moment for that transport to understand if we brought them in-house, could we make potential savings? So we're investigating that, and that work is currently ongoing. Moving on to environment and waste on page 24. Under the, you'll see there is one revised recycling and household waste delivery model, 350,000. That is about accruing the full year savings from bringing in the recycling and household waste sites, which you're aware we did come 1st of July last year, 2017. We are also the payment mechanism for the revised payment mechanism for recycling credits. Those figures are what we will now see coming forward from the 1st of April when we're implementing that new system there in terms of credits. The only other one I would highlight in that piece is future residual waste at the bottom of the page, ET19. Again, members will be aware that a report went to Scrutiny recently seeking approval to purchase a Part C shareholder in the Coventry and Solihull waste disposal. The savings that accrue from that are from reduced gate fees from that arrangement that we will then be able to access those reduced fees on the 40,000 tonnes of residual waste that goes in there. That's the savings that are currently in the MTFS that are in train in the department. We, however, are taking forward a number of initiatives to look at future savings. So those savings under development that you will see on page 25. Again, linking into what we've just discussed, future residual waste strategy there, that figure comes from increased tonnages through that Part C share arrangement. So that's about increasing what we actually put through there and benefiting from those savings. Highway delivery model, that's looking at how we deliver our operational side of the highway service. Do we have the most effective arrangement? Could there be joint arrangements? How can we access more commercial activity, etc.? In a similar vein, income generation from Section 278. For information, Section 278 is where a third party, such as a developer, has to do works within the highway. They are required to, one, get our approval, but two, enter into a Section 278 agreement to undertake those works. We are investigating the possibility that we, as the County Council, undertake more of those works under the Section 278 on behalf of the developer and thereby potentially generate income. So that's another piece we are looking at, piece of work we're looking at. Over the page 26, back to recycling and household waste centres. That we're looking at potential future model in the shape of that service. So considering opening hours, number of sites, etc., to explore if there's anything further we may want to do to achieve savings. Just for your information, there are external influences highlighted there. I think they're pretty self-explanatory, but happy to take questions on that if you have following this. And for your awareness, again, paragraph 24, other funding sources, just to, gives you a real broad view of some of the sources of income and funding we get into the department, which, I'm sure you'll see are fairly varied. For instance, driver education workshops, often people forget about that, and that's where somebody goes on a course instead of getting penalty points on their licence for speeding. We get the residual income over and above the cost of operating the courses. We also have joint arrangement incomes, whereby, in the example given there is Leicester City Council, we deliver the concessionary travel scheme for them, and similarly we do the back office notice processing for car parking tickets on behalf of the district councils. I'm going to finish there, Chair, if that's all right, and would welcome questions.
Thank you, Anne. Before we go to questions, has Mrs Radford or Mr Payne or Mr Rose anything to add to the presentation at this stage?
Chairman, not at this stage.
No?
Happy to take the questions as they come.
Okay. So members, please refer to your buff sheets of paper. So can we take questions then, or any questions you might have or comments you might have on service transformation, paragraphs 7 to 9 on pages 17 and 18. Any comments, anybody? Mr Hunt.
I think that as has become the custom, this has been a very difficult budget to put together, and I think officers are to be commended on the work that they've done, and the work that has been ongoing in several areas, particularly in waste and recycling, where we've saved a lot of money by, I think, some very hard work, but also in highways delivery, where we've had a very flexible approach and made many of the economies we've had to make because our funding has been cut back. Now, I'm referring to paragraph 9 here. This is as it stands this year, but this is a 4-year budget, and or 4-year MTFS, I should say, this year's budget. And what we see here are a number of services which are going to be heavily under scrutiny over the next 12 months. I have to say the director's made it all sound so easy. And I know the work that's been done already has been very difficult and challenging. But we're talking in paragraph 9 about reconsidering areas of savings that have already been looked at and not progressed, in other words, dismissed. So we're now going back to look at some of those services that we daren't touch previously. And I'd hazard to say that, although we're not going to talk in depth on this one, I think tonight or this afternoon, but the SEN transport thing looms very large with all of us. But also the effects on public transport that are in here, which I think are going to concern people in detail. And there are some amber lights on that. But what does concern me is that the situation has got so powerless, even though we are projected to raise the full limits on council tax. We are going to council tax maximum increase, as I understand it so far. So even doing that, we are still being punished by the government for the misdeeds of the past. I would say the bankers, other people might say someone else. So that's what concerns me most, and we'll be looking in detail at that. I think that's all I have to say at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Hunt. Thank you for your kind words at the beginning of what you said. I'm sure that's true. Dr Rimner.
Thank you, Chair. Page 18.6. As this is an overview, I was interested to read, we'll also be looking at how best we can access additional income that, whilst not being permitted to make a profit as such, allows us to cover some of our costs, especially our overheads and fixed costs of operation. Perhaps, as a government has already been mentioned, perhaps we could encourage the government to see whether local authorities could make just a little bit more profit on some of their activities. But I know that the officers are looking at flexible ways to make additional income, and I think all of us around this table would welcome that in any ways or means they can find.
Thank you, Dr. Bremner. Anne, is there anything there you want to respond to?
No, sorry, no.
Okay, if we've covered that area, can I refer members to pages 18 and 19, the proposed revenue budget and budget transfers and adjustments. These are paragraphs 10 to 17 on those pages. Has any member got any comments or questions on areas contained on those pages? Dr. Bremner.
Just a small one, because I think an alternative thing is said later in the documentation. On page 18.11, at the bottom there, it says compiled on the basis of no payer price inflation. I would have thought, though, within the modelling that you would have to incorporate an annual increase in wage. But I think later in the documentation it does say that, but it didn't say it here. Thank you.
Sorry, I think what the difference is actually we don't do that within the department. That's held centrally. I think there's a full acknowledgement, yes, we build that in and that's modelled, but actually the way we seem to budget it here at Leicestershire is that is held in corporate services budget, not the department's budget. It's then allocated out as that comes to fruition. Nick, however, my colleague will correct me on that if I'm not.
No, I wouldn't say it was not right, but what we do as part of our modelling is we will estimate what the inflationary aspects are of our costs, and we'll feed those through to corporate finance, who will use that information to make an overall assessment of the amount they need to hold corporately within a central inflation contingency. And then as we move through the year, that money is then released from the central contingency and built into budgets based on what actually inflation pressures come through.
That's a very good explanation of detail, but if a member, heaven forbid, of the public would read this paperwork and just read those two lines without that context you've given, they would think that you're not taking something into account in your budget. I just thought might be there you need to flesh that out rather than a stark statement. I don't know.
I would just say, I mean, I take that as I take your point on that one. I do think the intention was through that wording, a central contingency will be held, which will be allocated to services necessary, was intended to convey that. But I fully appreciate that's because we're all in the know, and it may not be as explicit as it could be.
And as a new member.
You've raised it now, Dr. Bremner. Thank you. Anybody else? No? In which case, can I refer members to growth and savings proposals. First of all, unchanged from the previous MTFS and items included in the previous MTFS. Any comments or questions on growth? Mr. Bolter.
Very formal this afternoon, Chairman. Yes, on the bottom of page 20, G18, I noticed still some money there, recycling credits. For the record, we know who they're being paid to now, just for the record.
Thank you. Joe, can you answer that?
So just to clarify, who's receiving credits currently?
Yes.
At the minute, all of the district councils, because we're still in this 17-18 financial year, but in relation to from
18-19.
From the 1st of April, 4 of the districts will not receive them from the 1st of April. Melton Borough Council's contract is out to renewal, so theirs will not stop until we've agreed their contract ends, because we said we would be reasonable, so they will have credits till the 30th of September. And then Charnwood and Blaby's contracts also end within the first 2 months of the next financial year. We are still in discussion with Blaby District Council to seek some confirmations on their contracts. So that one is not as yet resolved, but they have all had their direction notices. So bar one, they know when they are being directed from.
Thank you.
That just seems a little unfair, Chair, because some districts will be stopping sooner rather than later, and others are carrying on. But I'm sure Mr. Rhodes will address that sometime in the future.
If I may, just on that, the consultation that all of the districts were involved in linked to their contracts took the better part of 3 years from 2014. So where certain contracts were entered into, I mean, we had to acknowledge that some districts enter into 7-year contracts for their refuse collection. There was not a natural break point, but they were asked to negotiate with. We have looked at the end dates linked to the terms of their contract to be as reasonable as possible.
Thank you. Members, any other questions? No? Can we move on to savings for highways and transport? The paragraph 20 on page 21. There are transformation savings on pages 21 and 22 and departmental savings on page 23. And you can see them all together on Appendix C at page 39. Any questions arising there? Mr. Bill.
T1. This is a move that we advocated all those years ago, and it has paid off. It was accepted, and we can see the savings here. And that's the good news. The not so good news is contained within the report, as far as we're concerned anyway. ET4, the revised passenger transport policy. This looks to me as if it's another reduction, a clear reduction in the offing on buses. And we were given an assurance back in May that the bus services, the existing bus services, would be retained. So the county seems to be going back on its word here. Because not only, I've been looking into this, not only are we bus services under threat, it's the sheer cost to people travelling on the buses, which is starting to become prohibitive as well. So it's the policy of actually moving people around by bus seems to be squeezed from both ends, both by ourselves and by the operators. So that's one issue. The SCN issue is one that we've referred to elsewhere and doesn't seem to want to go away at all. But the problem with this is that it says it's subject to consultation, which is fine. The consultation is now closed. But the problem is that if this money is taken out of the budget at this stage, this means that the consultation will have had little effect in itself, because the decision has actually been taken to withdraw the money. So that's a problem that we have with ET5. But the more serious one, if you like, is ET10, the county-wide parking strategy. We've asked about this before, and we've also asked for details about how this is going to be implemented. Because, I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but I have pointed out on several occasions now that as far as my hometown is concerned, as far as Hinckley is concerned, I cannot see any streets on which this could possibly operate. And we're getting close now to the implementation of this. 2019-20 means that presumably the traffic management orders and all the rest of it will have to be brought in before too long. And so we're voting for something here where we simply do not know the impact of the implications of what we're doing. I would still very much like to see a list of the streets, well, not only in Hinckley, which I obviously got a personal interest in, but the other market towns where presumably this is going to be brought in. All we want is some kind of indicative list of how this could possibly work, because I've got my doubts that it would work at all. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bill. As I understand it, we're not taking any votes on this paper today, and I think the county-wide parking strategy has yet to be formed, and I think that will come up at a future scrutiny meeting of this committee sometime in the future. But can I go to the Director to ask her if she would elaborate on ET4, ET5, and confirm what I've just said about ET10, if indeed it's correct?
Certainly, thank you very much. In terms of the first point raised about passenger transport policy, this very much is looking at where we are as Leicestershire in terms of interpreting that legislation to understand what that means out there for public transport. Obviously, yes, there will be a concern around implications for services. However, where the policy then dictates that actually there is a need, there is an essential need there, we will put something on then in terms of transport for those communities. Now, I think what that might mean and where we can drive efficiencies with, our available resources is traditionally public transport means for most people a bus, a 50-seater running around the countryside with not very many people on it. Ultimately, there are other things that we are able to do that are more cost effective that can still meet people's needs in order to get them to the services, to the shops, to the medical centres, etc. So I think the challenge is there in terms of, yes, we've got limited resources, but actually it's about what we put on to meet those essential needs, to then demonstrate we are getting value for money as well for our community and for the taxpayers of Leicestershire. I appreciate the points about the cost for passengers in terms of public transport services. Obviously, ultimately, when the government deregulated bus services in 1985, if we can all remember that far back, actually, it's a commercial market. So the bus companies are pricing it whereby they are making their profit, etc. If there isn't enough demand in the services from those communities, ultimately it doesn't work for the bus companies. And their shareholders are, they're under strict instructions, aren't they? They're not going to do it because they're not charities. So they withdraw, and we then have to look at it to see if there's alternatives in place that actually meet the needs of that community. And if not, what do we put on? Traditionally, we put on another bus. In future, chances are it may be a different type of service if there is nothing there in that community. We will be the provider of last resort, so there will be something there to ensure essential needs are met within that context of value for money. There will always be that criteria because unfortunately we don't have an unlimited pot, as this report highlights to you. I'll move on then. Parking. In terms of that parking, on-street parking charges, I very much understand, the need to want the detail. However, we're just at a much earlier stage than that, unfortunately. It'd be great if I could provide you that, as soon as possible. We need to fully understand the business case, and as I touched on in my introduction, the work we have to date, we're not convinced it's robust enough to go forward on. We're doing some further work. When we have a business case and when we will develop up a policy that supports our view, or Leicestershire's view of what transport for parking our policy should be, that in place, and subject to there being a robust business case, there will then be consultation. If that's approved and we get through that, what we will need to do is draw up detailed schemes for each location where this would be implemented, including Hinckley, obviously, if the business case stacked up for Hinckley. At that point, there will be the detail of which streets, what will happen, what will be the charging, what will be the waiting, etc. Along with, actually, what are the displacement issues? Do we need residence parking, etc., etc.? There will be a full consideration. It's at that point that detail will be available, and that, again, will go to public consultation. So there will be full opportunity for communities, etc., to have their say on that and to shape those. So it's purely a matter of timing on that, but that information will be available further on in this process. Your third point was SEN. In terms of SEN, yes, and I think hopefully we made this clear when we brought the report to Scrutiny last year in terms of those proposals to seek Scrutiny's comments. was that in terms of the estimation of the savings made, we presented very much a midpoint, because things such as you'll appreciate as personal travel budgets, etc., it's hard to dictate exactly, you know, the numbers that will, the uptake of that, etc. So there was lots of variables within those factors in the proposals we put forward. So what we actually did was present a midpoint in those savings. So there is some leeway in terms of meeting the figures there. The other aspect I would say is in there, and again it was covered in that scrutiny report, there was an element of savings that came out of work that's going on in adults and communities department in terms of reviewing their processes in part of providing, you know, adult social care, transport, etc. And in doing that, they were driving some efficiency savings that contributed to this amount. Therefore, you know, there's elements of the savings that are not entirely to do with what we brought you in the scrutiny report and what was consulted on. There's additional elements there. I think I'll stop on that.
Thank you. Mr. Bolter.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, thank you. Right, not to reinvent the wheel too much, but ET4. Now, members well know I do tend to keep papers from previous meetings. And I do remember that a certain budget meeting last year, when a proposal was put forward to reduce the amount of money spent on passenger transport, a certain cabinet member stood up and said, "Oh, we've found some extra money. We're going to support the bus services now and continue the existing practice, and it will not appear again for the next 4 years." Now, this is quite easy to do because it was on tape, and County Council is very fortunate to keep these tapes for a number of years. So it's quite evident there that that was made by a cabinet member. So I was rather concerned when a cabinet member made a statement, and the 12 months later, there's no dot at the side, no 2 dots at the side. It appears as a new item. Now, many of people living in the rural areas voted for those people because they're keeping their bus service. And now, they could well be losing their bus service. So this reduces the credibility of what the County Council says at some of its meetings, which I'm concerned about. Anyway, there's 33 services supported at the moment. We'll see where that turns up in the end. But I'm very concerned about this appearing again so shortly after the first statement was made. Regarding SEN transport, yes, last meeting we had a report that was going to Cabinet, we commented on. That's one thing. That was talking about the Cabinet meeting and support to Cabinet. Today we're talking about budgets. Different thing completely. Because if we're not careful, the Cabinet's going to turn around and say, "Oh, I'm very sorry, but due to finances, we've got to make these cuts." Forget the consultation, we've got to make the cuts. Now, to me, you know, that's not quite how things should be done. We do a consultation, and that bears some resemblance to what comes out at the end of the meeting. To actually put this amount of money in the budget, saying if we're going to save this amount of money before we do the consultation and get the results of the consultation, is perhaps putting the cart before the horse. So I'm a bit concerned about that. David's already spoken about the county-wide parking strategy, which we've got some doubts about. We've expressed those doubts. The other thing I did bring up before, Mr. Rhodes will remember, because he chaired the employment committee when I was employment. I think he will remember, he's a man of good memory, that the total budget for staff absence was £3 million, give or take £1 or £2, over the whole county council. An extreme amount of money. In fact, Mr. Rhodes was directed by the members to go and write to Mr. Sinnott. Asked Mr. Sinnott to look at this as a most urgent matter. because a lot of money is £3 million. So I was quite surprised that a relatively small amount of money was down here for staff absence, 25,000 in 2019-20 and 50,000 on 2021. I'd have thought perhaps a more stretching target would have been put there. I suppose the answer is going to be it's spread out amongst all the departments. That's the usual answer. Some departments have more absence than others, and I accept that because of the nature of the department. But, you know, if you're looking at the council budget, it's £3 million overall. You're never going to achieve all that, I appreciate that, but a good percentage of that could well be saved across the whole of the council. I think that's doing those pages, Chair. I think that's enough to comment on at the moment.
Thank you, Mr. Bolter. I don't think we really ought to try and anticipate what Cabinet might come up with on the SEN transport. That is for us to look at when they do come up with it. I think the Director covered the area of ET4, but is there anything more you want to add, Anne, on ET4? I'll come to you, Byron, in a moment.
All I would add is, you know, yes, subject to, I mean, these things are always subject to a whole process. So, you know, we've just got to go through each stage. It's the same with any other, most other savings on the list here. One, we put them down to think, actually, this is something that may stack up, we may be able to deliver, but as ever, there's hurdles on that way, be that internal improvements, be that public consultation, etc. However, this is what we're aiming to do. Some, hopefully, most will come to fruition, but they don't always, and I guess that one comes into the same category there. Thanks.
Yes, just a couple of comments. On the question of the passenger transport policy, we did have a savings proposal in the MTFS last year, which we drew at the County Council meeting, which is perfectly correct. And at that time, we said that we would take it out on that occasion, but we would continue to do a review of passenger transport policy and to see if we can achieve better value for money. And of course, that's now what has happened. That's continued. And it's a result of that a new proposal has been put forward. And if I can carry on, and to reply to the other point on staff absence, the figure of 3 million, I think, referred to the total amount of staff absence, which of course was not ever going to be possible to take it down to zero. So there's a target being put in, which is a realistic target for each department of the County Council. And what we have in the papers here is the one for environment and transportation. There are similar targets being put in the other departments, and some of those other departments are larger, so the figures are greater.
Mr. Bolter, you wanted to come back?
Yes. I listened to Mr. Rose's explanation very carefully. Perhaps I'll refer him to the video, the screenshots that from the Cabinet meeting. He might like to perhaps change some of his words. But if he's actually correcting what he says, this would have had a dot at the side of the programme here, passenger transport, because it means it was still under consideration. The fact it's not got a dot at the side of it, it was deleted at the Cabinet at the full Council meeting, not to appear again for 4 years. It has appeared again. There's no dot there. So that means to me it backs up my argument rather than Mr. Rose's.
I think we could do with an explanation of what the dots are. Could I ask someone to explain what is one dot and what is two dots?
It's there already.
Page 19, there's an explanation.
Can I refer you to page 19 then, Mr. Bill? Mr. Bolter, I beg your pardon. Yes.
Sorry, could I just add to Mr. Rhodes' point on absence there? We have as a matter of course, as each department has a major drive on managing absence. So there's lots of works going on within each department to make sure that, you know, we're dealing with short-term and long-term absence, and that happens throughout the service. This is an addition to that, so we just make that final point.
Thank you. Mr. Hunt, please.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. Just referring to the points that have been made, I'm referring to ET 4, 5 and indeed 10, but in less detail than my colleagues because they've covered the ground. But in a sense, the Conservatives may have been duplicitous before the last election. They may have sugared the pill. But essentially, as paragraph 19, which I mentioned earlier, says we're now reconsidering things that we actually have not progressed with in the past. And we will expect, I dare say, to see things that we've dismissed in the past coming back for more punishment, perhaps. The point about ET4 and ET5, the revised passenger transport and the SCN transport, is, in a sense, they're both about needs. And in fact, other committees are looking at needs at the moment, I'm sure, adults and communities and indeed young people. And that's what this budget is all about. It's all about trying to balance needs against a smaller and smaller budget. The problem arises, and it's been apparent in adult and community services for a while, that what are the real needs of our clients and our service users? And we say in ET4 it's essential needs, and we say in ET5 it's personal travel budgets, as if perhaps, you know, they will meet what we might reasonably consider as someone's needs. But in fact, the only person who can really understand their needs is often the client or the service user. And my fear is when we say we will still consider to meet people's essential needs, that is a subjective discussion, and one I think that this committee will have to come back to when these papers eventually arrive on our desks during the year. And of course the same goes for the SEN transport. These are the two themes that I think are going to cover the whole budget come February. Can I just touch on county-wide parking strategy? I absolutely accept that there are going to be some very difficult decisions made here, and hopefully they will be wise decisions which take into account the needs of people living around town centres and the needs of people who wish to use the shopping centres of our small towns. But there will be issues here which I'm sure will help some people. And I think that's the balance that has to be made. And I just want to mention one thing, because this has had a certain amount of negative stuff, and that's understandable. But in my area, we're surrounded by residence parking areas which really owe their invention back to the 1970s, probably, when we first started looking at residence parking schemes. And in many cases, they do not fit the needs of the people they were designed to serve. And just to give you an example, the never-ending problem is one of carers and family who want to make fleeting visits to their family or their service users, and they are effectively have their lives made very difficult by residence parking schemes. If we can make some of those resident parking areas paying areas that people can park for a reasonable amount of time for a reasonable cost, and I say reasonable cost because that's another bone of contention with residence parking, that could be a benefit. So let's see what's on offer on those three issues when they come up. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Hunt. You mentioned earlier on punishment. I don't think punishment is an acceptable phrase that we want to use in this context, but I will ask officers or lead members if they wish to make any comments. Start with Mr. Rhodes.
Yes, I'm glad you've mentioned that word punishment. It's an inappropriate word, I think, to use in this context. What we're trying to do is to design a service or modify a service, depending on what particularly we're looking at, and make it appropriate and optimise it. At the same time, staying within the financial constraints which we find ourselves, and I think that's a very honourable thing to do, and I don't think we're punishing anybody or even setting out to punish anybody, so it's an unreasonable charge to make. Just a comment on the on-street parking questions. There are other authorities that have introduced this, and I do actually visit a particular city in England which has got this arrangement, Exeter as it happens. It seems to work extremely well there. And I actually, at first, I didn't realise there was one until I noticed the meters every 100 metres or so, as it were. But there's no marking on the roads or anything like that. It's done in a very, very reasonable and sensible way. And people are very happy with it because it does control the amount of parking and excessive parking in those particular areas. And it seems to me to be something which certainly when I visit that city, I'm quite happy to accommodate myself to, and I don't find any difficulty with it. So whether we adopt something along those lines, I don't know, but eventually when we look at this, I think that we will find numerous examples which we can draw on to design a scheme.
Thank you. Mr. Payne.
Yes, thanks, Chairman. Just on the same point, county-wide parking strategy, members will note that there are a couple of asterisks, although I note that paragraph 15 refers to them as stars, by the side of that. That actually indicates that this is a proposal that's been on previous MTFSs, so we have debated this before. And like before, it's still in the work in progress stage. As lead member, I have yet to be briefed on the consultant's work around this. And whilst I will concede that perhaps there are challenges with the proposal, equally as just been mentioned, it seems to me there could be some benefits here as well. In my mind, my inbox at points in time is full of complaints about congestion in certain parts of the county, and I can see that the county-wide parking strategy may play a role in perhaps improving that, and perhaps ensuring that people, if they are travelling into various urban centres, consider the transport choices that they have in order to do so. So once all the information's back, I think it's worthy of a proper debate, not least around this particular panel, so we can take the proposal forward, if that's what we choose to do, based on proper information. But that information simply doesn't exist at this point in time.
Thank you. Director, you wanted to say something?
Just a final point on the residence parking. We can certainly consider things like, mixed use in terms of payment and, residents, etc., to make those schemes more useful and obviously meet the needs of those communities. And that is something we will do in detail if we get to that stage in this.
Mrs. Radford.
Yeah, just really to comment on ET4, it does say that there's a new passenger transport policy being developed, and I would expect it to come back to this committee when we've got a policy for it to be looked at and members be able to comment and things like that.
Thank you. Any further questions on this section of the report? No? Can we move on to environment and waste and the savings thereon? Starting off at page 24. Transformational savings and departmental savings. These are also highlighted in Appendix C. Mr. Bill.
I raised the issue of the review of recycling and household waste sites. I know it's been claimed that the reduction in opening hours, which has already been introduced, and charging has no impact on, is not responsible for all the fly tipping that's going on, but it just so happens it's happened at the same time. Since this was introduced, there has been a tremendous amount of fly tipping, and we want to be absolutely certain, don't we, that if we reduce the hour, if we intensify this move towards the reduction of hours and increasing charges, that it doesn't lead again to further fly tipping. I think I'd like to be assured that there's no connection and it's just a coincidence that there are so many irresponsible people around. But I think it's causing an enormous problem for the people who live in the areas affected, and for the district councils that have to pay for the clearing up operations.
Joanna,
Chair,
yes.
if I may, through you. I'm just going to slightly differentiate, if I may, between a section that we haven't got to yet, which is savings under development, which is to revisit the services that we have. I'm assuming that we're talking about everything that we've done under ET13, which is a substantial suite of changes to service. And whilst that very small residual balance of savings that are yet to be delivered, it has delivered this £655,000 with the change of hours, as Mr. Bill has said, and introducing charging for some construction and demolition waste. All I would reassure is that officers do very detailed analysis about what is happening both locally and nationally on fly tipping, and it's a very complex area that the evidence doesn't support that any single change is the root cause of what's happening with fly tipping. Nationally, Leicestershire tracks below the national average, and it is a problem that's existed for years, and yes, it is on the rise, but if you were to look at the profile of fly tipping over 5 or 10 years, it will look like a heart monitor screen. It will go up and down, and ours does that as well. Now, to attach, when we've made service changes, that hasn't correlated directly with an increase in fly tipping. So it's a more complicated picture than that. We do accept as officers, yes, we've introduced charging. Some of that illegal material, if there's activity, may have gone in the hedgerows. But when we did I'll just give a quick example, if I may. When we did some very detailed analysis with Hinckley and Bosworth, because Blake, as our portfolio holder, is very keen on this issue and to try and understand it, that construction and demolition material was very limited in what was being found as the fly-tipped type of material. They were seeing far greater levels of green waste and even general household waste, which continues to be free to take to the recycling house or waste sites. So there is an issue there for us to work with the district colleagues to try and understand whether the public are confused by service change, and we would take that on board. So we need to have a look at how we take this forward. And all I would reassure is that we are working. There's a working group between ourselves, all of the district councils, and the city, who we need to work closely with, trying to tackle this issue of fly tipping and understand what communications we need to do. Because my final point would be anything that we do in the county, if we didn't work closely with the city, you'd simply see a movement of that material between partners. Thank you.
Mr. Payne.
Chairman, can I just add to what Joe's just mentioned to the committee? We spend a lot of time, certainly at previous scrutiny meetings of the Environment and Transport Committee, talking about fly tipping, and each time I point out that under this two-tier system we have in Leicestershire, the borough and district councils have responsibility for enforcement and collection, but we obviously do have a relationship in terms of we still have to pick up the costs of fly tip material here as the disposal authority. And I'd say that the business cases that are put together to support policies and proposals contained within the MTFS and those that we've already implemented do recognise those costs. They are built in to our business cases. We bring those proposals forward based on that financial consideration. The other thing I'd just point out, whilst we don't have the responsibility for the enforcement and for the collection of fly tip material, some of you might have seen a BBC News piece only a couple of days ago, perhaps as long as 7 days ago, and they compared Leicester City's incidences of fly tip material, which gets reported. We all have a responsibility to report up to national government the incidences each year. And I understand they had something like 8,000. I might stand corrected, but the piece essentially was saying there was 8,000 incidences of fly tip material. And when you compare that to Derby and Nottingham City, they both had 2,000 incidences in the financial year. So obviously there's a huge discrepancy between what's happening in Leicester City and what's happening in Nottingham and Derby. Now, fly tipping is a national issue, and it's recognised that it's on the increase generally. But given that Leicester City are the centre of the donut to the county, we are impacted on those incidences. And Leicester City, being a unitary authority, do have the powers to undertake the enforcement. And in my previous experience, I have noticed a connection between the enforcement costs that Leicester City and the enforcement measures Leicester City take at any point in time, and an increase in fly tipping in certain parts of the county. So it's a very complex area, and one that we keep a close eye on, and I think Joe is absolutely right. We need to continue to work with our district and borough partners to address this nationally significant issue. Thank you.
Mr Bolter?
Thank you. Similar subject, but I understand the government's looking at whether councils should charge for tipping certain things or not, and that's an officer parliamentary working group looking at that, which no doubt will feed through to us at some time in the future, so no doubt we'll take that into account when we do these things, sooner rather than later. However, Chair, looking for a nail to hang something on, we understand that China is no longer going to accept plastics. Now, that being the case, I'm fully behind that. Don't get me wrong, fully behind that. And some supermarkets are now talking about not producing products in plastic, working over a 5-year period to do all that from their shelves. Fully behind that. But what effect is that going to have on us as a county council? And in particular, I noticed that we are moving waste to another facility in Coventry and elsewhere that requires plastics to increase the calorific value of the process. Now, if the plastic's not going to be produced, how are we going to be feeding into that process? And also, I know it's perhaps straying on to the next bit, but as we're going to be a Class C shareholder in these facilities, have we got any liability at all if they can't meet their targets of heat generation in future years? It's a 30-year contract, so 5 years might be all right, but 30 years might come round and bite us. So I just wonder about the implications of that. Thank you, Chair.
Would you like to address that now? I know it's coming up later on, but if you address it now, it might help. Mr Bolter.
Thank you, Chair. I'll try. You'll remind me if I miss any of that. There's a few things in there. In terms of charges and the parliamentary working group, yes, we actively feed into those things. We're a member of NORDO, the National Association of Waste Disposal Authorities, so we have quite a strong voice at some of these working groups. So we will be engaging around future policy, and we are actively pursuing central government to come out with their waste and resources plan, which we need in order to make long-term decisions around waste. And you're right, we commission contracts for residual waste that can run to 20 or 30 years, so we do need line of sight of what's coming in the long term. But we're working with government and we're waiting for their direction on that. In terms of China, just for those in the room that may not have picked it up, yes, we're very aware that China, as of this month, have banned the import of mixed plastics and paper and have significantly reduced what they'll accept as what they call contamination to 0.5%. I have got some figures, and I can talk outside the meeting in terms of the scale of exports that the UK makes to China, and it's substantial. But in terms of what it means, it's arguably too early to say. I had some very interesting mixed messages yesterday in the trade press about the fact that China are now very unhappy that they're being starved of plastics. So the reaction within the industry has been to find alternatives. So I think there's some way to go yet in terms of what that will actually look like. What I can tell you is that in the UK we're not stockpiling, so the material is still finding an end destination, be it mixed plastics or not. We are seeing a drop in the value of mixed plastics, but in terms of Leicestershire, we knew we were going to direct the districts from this coming April to our contractors for the processing of recyclables. We have engaged with those contractors that they're not currently ours yet, but to understand if they feel they're impacted by China's announcement. And we have been reassured that at the minute they are not yet affected. They are not supplying to China. They supply into the UK, and because of the level of sorting they do, they're not dealing in mixed plastics. They're separating out those plastics. So it gives some confidence that the contracts that we have are not going to be early effective, but we will have to look at contamination and work with our districts on that. In terms of wider policy change, I've touched on the fact that nationally we're waiting on some direction, but you specifically gave the example of the Coventry and the Class C share that we're taking, and how we plan with such a state of flux. And it's always been there from a waste perspective. If you look back 10 years, there was far more news and PAMs, newspapers and magazines in the waste than there are now, because people have gone very digital in their habits of how they read. So it's not in the waste stream in the way that it was. The same may happen with plastics. In terms of its calorific value when you burn it, that liability will sit with the other shareholders. Our share that we will take, which yes will take us to 2040, is limited in its liability. That's deliberate. So what it does is give us a preferential gate fee. We've only committed up to 80,000 tonnes of material. That's also deliberate. So we haven't put all our residual waste in one contract. We don't need to feed that contract. And we are not concerned about the returns that that organisation has to make on the calorific value of the material it puts in.
Thank you. Any further questions or comments? Thank you. Can we now look at paragraphs 21 to 23, and we'll include paragraphs 24 as well, departmental external influences and other funding sources. Any comments on those paragraphs? Mr. Poland.
Thank you, Chair. Just like to comment on 21.4, if possible, the reuse opportunities at the tip sites. I think that's a cracking idea. I've got to say, I really do think it is. I know the ones in the tips in Leicester, for instance, have a Loros shop. Certainly the ones I've been to. I say a shop, it's like a drop-off point. So for things that would otherwise be tipped but actually are in a usable condition, you can stop there, give it to charity, they'll then do it up and sell it on for, well, in that case, for Loros. And everyone's a winner, frankly, because that's something that we're not dealing with then in terms of either recycling or just landfilling the thing. That's something the charity then gets, of course, to fill the shops, and obviously then has the end product of hopefully selling it to raise some money. So if that is something we can do, I think that's a great idea and something I'd certainly welcome to see in our county's tips. Thank you.
Any further questions or comments?
Chair, just from me, Chair, I think we agree. I think one of the benefits of us bringing the running of 13 of our recycling house or waste sites in-house is we can make some of those autonomous decisions on what we do with the likes of the service, and that's a really great example of something we're going to look at.
Thank you, Joe. Did you, Mr. Coxon?
Yeah, just on the, Mr. Poland has said what I was going to say about the reuse sites. It's a really good thing to do. But I did ask perhaps last year about taking trade waste at our other sites. I mean, I know we take trade waste, I think it's Whetstone. But have we done any more work on possibly taking trade waste at any of the other sites to generate some income, really, on certain items?
Chair, through you, it arguably links to 5 as well in terms of the future service offer and us having, yes, another very difficult look back over the service in terms of it's a very different service, open different days of the week, different hours than it was 3 or 4 years ago. I would envisage that under that work we will also look at trade waste services, and this is not to suggest this is something we will absolutely do, but if I were just horizon scanning any number of options, we already have the charging infrastructure in place through the operatives on all of our sites that charge members of the public for construction and demolition waste. It would require a policy change because we currently have a permitting system for people who use a van and it's their main vehicle. But it may be that we could use the same infrastructure to charge at all of the sites. It needs us to look at all of the logistics of that, but my view would be in that full suite of assessments so that we could look at whether we could do more with trade waste at the sites.
Mr Payne.
Can I just quickly add, Chairman, that whilst we're talking about waste and recycling sites, and welcome the comments from Mr Poland about the reuse proposal, we've spoken before about the number of sites we have in Leicestershire. I think Leicester City has 2 sites, if I'm not mistaken. 2 sites. We have 14 across the county, so obviously the scale of what we're dealing with is very different to what Leicester City. Added on top of that, we made a policy decision to bring the running of 13 of those sites back into the County Council last year, has afforded us some opportunities. What I'm really pleased to see at my last lead member meeting, there's been an initial survey undertaken with, I think, about just over 4,000 people. And in all of the criteria that they were asked to comment on, we're receiving above 90% satisfaction in most of the sub-criteria with regards to the running and the operation of our waste and recycling sites. That is really pleasing to see, and I understand that is being supported by a national survey as well that we've spoken about in full council in terms of the condition of our roads, etc. They also survey waste and recycling sites as one of the criteria, and our initial survey that we've done off our own back is actually supported with national data as well. So I think the department deserves a big pat on the back for not only the successful internship of the sites, but also how they're going about running them at the moment.
Thank you. Any further comment on these sections? Mr Jennings.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'm making a guest appearance here this afternoon, so I don't know, perhaps I'm back.
You're very welcome as
well. But the waste and recycling sites, there's 1 million people live in Leicestershire, which 1/3 of a million live in the city and 2/3 in the county. They only have 2 sites in the city. We have 14 in the county. Now, when I was here, be it some time ago, concern was expressed about the number of people coming out of the city to use our sites and the costs inflicted on this authority by having to pay for the city users. Have we made any progress into sorting that out?
Can you address that, Joe?
Yeah, through you, Chair, yes. We did look at it. It still does happen. We even saw that through the user satisfaction surveys that Blake's mentioned. However, being very honest, there are arguably as many individuals that go from county and use city sites.
I think Mr Poland's visited one.
So I think at the moment, though, we revisit policy, and it will in all likelihood be part of that major body of work. At the moment, there is some form of quid pro quo. There is an acknowledgement that because of a lack of understanding, city residents that use county facilities outside the boundary and vice versa. When we've done the work, it was negligible, but we would need to revisit that and keep that in mind, because what we don't want to be doing is encourage costs from city residents. We do keep an eye on it.
Did you want to comment on this, Mr.
Just
Payne?
very quickly, we know we have looked at this issue, and I received a letter from the lead member over a year ago of Nottingham City or County Council looking to implement charges for out-of-county, out-of-city users of their waste and recycling sites. Clearly, we receive our fair share, and it's reciprocated in Leicestershire, so you can imagine what kind of letter they got back. But I think the reality is we've looked at schemes, and I think other neighbouring authorities have looked at schemes, and I think in many respects they're undeliverable. From a working mechanism, I think to introduce a scheme would be very, very difficult to do and very costly.
Thank you. Mrs Radford.
Yeah, just to digress slightly about recycling, I don't know whether members are aware that County also do days where people can take their old furniture to revamp it and that. And also they do things like that with clothes, which I'm trying to get the comms people to let us be aware. I mean, we could do 1 or 2 at the Fair and Hall in Loughborough, which is slightly out of my area, but it's close. But it's really just to let people know how you can upgrade your furniture that you might have been taking to a tip, and clothes that you might have just been dumping, and how to reuse them. So we are looking at other, ways of stopping people from taking them to, I keep saying the tip, but the refuge.
Recycling.
Right, refuge recycling. Anyway,
The tip.
Thank you. Mr. Hunt.
Well, I've enjoyed this discussion, and I'm grateful that members have raised it. Just struck me that we are puffing our chests out and saying how wonderful it is that we've got 14 waste sites in the county, whereas you've only got 3. Maybe we've got too many. I mean, you know, we're looking for cost savings. By the way, I welcome the innovative reuse and so on initiatives. I mean, I've got 3 waste sites within probably a 10-minute drive of my front door. So, yeah. But I'm just making the point, Chair, that more does not always mean better in all respects.
Either that or there's an awful lot of waste in your area, Mr. Hunt. Mr. Poland.
Thank you, Chair. Just a really quick comment on the terms of the tip locations. I think actually I would have concerns about looking at charging city residents for using our tips, because obviously then it would be vice versa. And yes, I will declare an interest. Actually, I live in Durmaston. It takes me 5 minutes to drive to my nearest tip, which is in the city, or I can drive 20 minutes to Mount Sorrel. Do you see what I mean? And it's just the reality is, I doubt there are many people in Durmaston that use the county tips. But likewise, if you live in where my mother and father-in-law live, which is on the Ayers Wanstead estate, the nearest one to them is probably Whetstone, which is one of ours and not in the city. So the minute we start sticking boundaries up and they're checking for IDs on entry, I don't think that would be a good thing.
Thank you. Any further comments on these final sections in the revenue budget proposals? Mr. Coxon.
Yeah, just on the point of looking at closing tips, as or recycling centres, as Mr. Hunt said, I certainly wouldn't be in favour of doing that. I think dealing with people's waste is one of the most fundamental things that people pay the council tax for, Chairman. And you know, it is a duty that we should perform well, enabling people to be able to dispose of their waste. So I certainly wouldn't sign up to anything like that, Chairman.
I'm sure we all heard that the department will be looking into this very subject in the near future, and the Assistant Director will have made note of members' comments. Thank you. So if there are nothing else on those particular paragraphs, before we move on to the capital budgets, does any member have any general comments on the revenue budget at all? Mr. Bolter.
Chair, can you record in the minutes, I think myself and Mr. Bill's concerns regarding ET4, ET5 and ET10? You're not taking a vote this afternoon, so I just want the comments recorded.
My colleague on my right-hand side is faithfully recording all members' comments.
Thank you.
And they are recorded for his use later.
Yes. We've also got the tape recording, haven't we?
Exactly.
Yes.
Yes. Anybody else? Mr. Payne?
Yeah, so just in summary on the revenue side of things, can I welcome what Max said right at the beginning of the meeting, because I concur with every word he said as lead member of the department and lead member of functions within the department for a number of years now. One of my jobs is to ask lots and lots of questions and to satisfy myself that no stone's left unturned when policy is being developed. And I can honestly say that the management of the department are exceptional. They've had some challenging times, and as the report said, they've stripped out £48 million from the department since 2011. That hasn't been easy, and they've done it intelligently. And we do have opportunities now, though, with the evolution of technology and the digital agenda that we've got going on. The feedback loops we're getting from service changes allows us to revisit the policies and to see whether we can get further efficiencies or actually make them better for the benefit of the public and the people that work in Leicestershire. So I'm confident that the team that the director's got will continue to do good work in that respect, and I'll join Max in thanking them and recognising their their good efforts. Just in relation to Mr. Bremner's points about government and is there opportunity to change the ways we do things? That there is. I mean, one example I thought of recently, a couple of years ago, we wouldn't have been allowed to internalise waste and recycling sites. We were forbidden. There was a law passed, I think, in the 70s or 80s that prevented local authorities from running those sites. So that's one example where the national legislation has changed and is providing us with an opportunity. And no doubt there'll be many, many more opportunities in the near future, and not least because of the waste strategy that should be forthcoming in 2018. So in summary, Chairman, I'm very supportive of the measures they're putting forward. They're not all easy. There is some challenges, but given where we are and the challenges that we faced, I think there's a very pragmatic approach to business. So thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Wash.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to make a technical clarification, I think, which may be important to help members. In terms of the asterisk star system, whichever we want to call it, the comparisons are made back to the MTFS that was approved by full council as of February last year. That MTFS didn't include any reference to anything in relation to public bus services because they were taken out, so that MTFS didn't have it. So therefore the ET4 reference should have no asterisks against it because it's comparing back to what was approved last year by full council. Just thought it was useful to clarify that.
Thank you for that clarification. I had made many comments on my paperwork here, and members have asked most of those questions. Thank you very much, members. I have just one question which I'd like to put, and that is with regard to highways and transportation, the bottom line total shows that of the gross budget, it is expected that some 40% would be external income to reduce that to a net budget of some 36,000. My question is, that's rather a high level, and can I just check the confidence level of achieving some 40% of the gross budget in external income? Anybody?
Sorry, can I just clarify? You're on Appendix A?
I'm on Appendix A, and I'm on the bottom line for highways and transportation. We have a gross budget of almost 57 million.
Yes.
Of that, we're expecting 21 million to come from external income. My question is, that is 40% of the gross budget. What is the confidence level of achieving that figure?
I can say we're relatively confident of that. As you can see, it's made up of things, one of the large chunks of that, 9 million, which is our concessionary travel and joint arrangement, which comes from Leicester City. That's been an ongoing arrangement for, a number of years and is continuing. So same with various other ones, we are relatively confident in that figure.
Thank you. Okay. Can we move on to the capital programme? Anne, did you want to make any report on that before we ask you questions?
Yes, if I may. Thank you, Chair. I'll just take you through a few highlights and give you an overview. Firstly, Table 3 on page 27, you've got 114 million in total for the department in capital over the next 4 years. I would just point out, in terms of the highway and transportation capital there, you will see the amounts go down as we get further, into the distance in future years. What I would say to that is we would fully expect those figures to change. As you're well aware, in terms of the capital scenario and world we live in these days, there's very many competitive bidding rounds that government announce and opportunities for capital, for us to secure capital. So we'd fully expect those figures in future years to change as we go for and hopefully are successful in securing more capital through those various funding streams. The table 4 on page 28 breaks down where that capital sits for highways and transportation. A couple of things I'd point out to you there. The first 3 rows of that table are about our local transport plan allocations from government. We are still waiting to hear and expect to hear shortly confirmation of those figures. These figures in there at the moment are indicative. However, early indications are they're likely to be the same. They're not going to change, but we do need to get that letter in writing from DFT, and we're expecting that shortly. The third row down, the incentive element, as you know, and you'll be aware because we've had discussions on this before, that is based on the fact that we achieve level 3 in terms of how we treat maintenance and how we deliver our maintenance. We are submitting the next submission to government to get that assessed in February, and we are relatively confident at this point at achieving Band 3 to secure that level of funding for our maintenance. Moving on, the next thing I would highlight is paragraph 31. As I say, that overall table for capital for highways and transport, just to illustrate the point that we'd expect the figures to change. As you'll be aware, we currently have a bid in with government for local major funding for the Melton Eastern Distributor Road, and that would be a government allocation if we're successful of 49 million, and so therefore hopefully we will in the very near future be able to add to that overall capital programme we've got going forward. Paragraph 32 covers the key elements of our own county council capital and how we're allocating that for services within the department. Key one there is, I would just highlight, is that first one there. Without that funding for either the ability to match fund in our bids or to get to a business case point so that when a funding opportunity arises, we would not be in a position to secure that. So, I would just highlight that one as particularly crucial to us in terms of our future capital programme. Paragraph 33 highlights some of the risks. And the ones I would want to just highlight to you are in terms of skills and securing skills. We're in an increasingly competitive market out there in terms of securing skills, both internally and if we want to actually procure contractors or consultants. And we're at the vagaries of a market, and the Carillion announcement earlier this week obviously just compounds that kind of challenge we have in delivering some of our capital schemes. Finally, penultimately, paragraph 34, there just shows you the list of types of funding streams that we can go for under competitive circumstances for securing that money. New ones come out all the time. These may change, etc. That last one, major road network funding, something relatively recent. Money won't be available till 2020, but something we will gear up to go for. The environment and waste capital programme there, as you see, just under £1 million, and as you'd imagine, focused on ensuring the maintenance and improvements of our recycling and household waste sites as that is needed. Lastly, the Future Developments Capital Programme there, that just highlights some of the areas where we may need capital funding in future. However, at this point in time, we're not 100% certain of that. There's various hurdles to go, so that gives you a taste of where we might require funding in future. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Members, can I direct you to, we'll include the top two paragraphs, 25 to 34 inclusive. Mr. Bolter. Can we come back to that shortly? Can we just address paragraphs 25 to 34? Mr. Jennings.
Yes, Chair, it's a point I do not understand. On page 28, table 4, there's a capital substitution amounting to £12.8 million. I don't understand why that is.
Basically, it's because some of the services we need to provide can only be funded from revenue, and the revenue budgets aren't sufficient. So we do a swap where we give back capital funding to the central contingency, and they use that to fund the corporate discretionary capital programme, and instead get given revenue money, which otherwise corporately they would have used to fund that discretionary programme instead. And it gives us that flexibility to manage services across both revenue and capital.
Thank you. It's clear, Mr. Jennings. Any other questions on these sections? No, thank you. Then I'll move on to the next section and invite Mr. Bolter to ask his question.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, I hark back yet again to a previous meeting where the leader of the council made an announcement about putting 7 speed cameras in various parts of the county. We did talk at the time, because at the moment the legislation is that the money for those speed cameras goes back to the central government, not retained by the county. Now, the idea was to ask the central government for permission to keep that money. I assume that question, I'm wrong to assume, Chair, but I assume that question's been asked the central government. Somebody might like to answer what the answer is. Mr. Payne is chanted at the bit here to have a go. But if we are going to introduce any more cameras, sure, that's the sort of thing we should sort out before we go down that route rather than after.
Mr. Payne, can you clarify, please?
Maybe the technical clarification will come from Anne or perhaps Ian, the Assistant Director, Deputy Director. What I can tell you, I've raised it with MPs and we haven't been very successful as of yet because we understand it's more of a Treasury issue than a Department for Transport issue because it involves revenue. And the misconception is about these cameras that we get to keep the money from the penalties, which of course we don't. These cameras generate money for the National Treasury. So we're working on a lobbying exercise to try and get the law tweaked. But I have some better news in terms of the pilot that we promised to put in place should go live actually towards the end of this month. We've got an indicative list of the rollout now. Those signs and those cameras have been procured through the safety partnership, which Ian might wish to speak about. And in the next couple of months, we should have some active average speed cameras doing what we said they would do. But on the sustainability issue, we do require a change of legislation from national government.
Mr. Veers, anything to add?
Yeah, just on the technical side. Firstly, I'm very pleased to announce in the next couple of weeks the first average speed cameras should be appearing across Leicestershire at those 7 sites. They have to be in place for a month. There is a grace period before enforcement starts via the police. So whilst the camera's up, part of the project is to do a very comprehensive report 1 year after, which will include and how would future monies be made available to pay for these, not only their ongoing capital costs but also their revenue costs. And finally, just as a sort of correction, there are 2 parts to the funding that comes from people committing offences and going on a course. There is the part that goes to the Treasury, which is the fine. If you go to a course, then the majority of the cost of the course is taken up with various checkings. We get to keep as part of the partnership anything that's left over from us being efficient in running the courses and how we manage the cameras. So there is a small element there that can come back to pay towards them. That will all be part of this report that we'll produce at the end of the 1 year trial. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Poland.
Thank you, Chair. Just to pick up on the speed cameras point discussion that we're having, I've got to say, I'm a little bit concerned that we're reading it in the context of raising money. I can live with speed cameras. I'm not a fan of speed cameras at the best of times, to be honest with you. But I can live with them in places where there's legitimate safety concerns. Okay. But what I don't like, and I have quite fundamental problems with, is when authorities, and I'm not talking about Leicestershire, but I'm talking across the country, use them as a way of merely, frankly, as a cash cow. To milk residents as far as possible. I've been to places, I'm thinking one in Oxfordshire and other places whereby the bottom of hills, they're hidden and they are designed to raise as much money as possible out of the motorists of this country, which frankly I think is disgraceful. So if we say there are areas that are real serious problems in terms of safety, like outside schools or something, then that's fair enough. But let's talk about it in terms of safety. And then if we're just talking it in terms of how we can raise so much more money, let's find drivers. I've got to say I would have real problems with that.
Thank you. That's a policy consideration. Could Mr. Payne make a comment or two?
Yes, there's a couple of points I want to make there. Be assured that the policy or the pilot that we're introducing is about a grave concern within the Leicestershire community regarding safety and community safety and road safety in particular. And we had a very good all-member briefing in this very room, I believe, a couple of months ago on that issue. They are intended to induce behaviour change upon motorists, specifically in areas where the data supports the location of the average speed camera pilot. What I would say, when we talk about costs, and I totally agree with every word you said, they shouldn't be used as a cash cow, and I think if Ian were to speak, he could explain to you where measures have been built in to ensure that that isn't the case. But there is a cost to operating these cameras and installing them, and at the moment the County Council are funding that as an initiative to try and induce, like I say, behaviour change. What we need to do is to make sure, if this is going to be sustainable, that those costs associated with operating these cameras wash their face. It's not about creating additional surplus monies. This is about, ensuring that we can fund the policy sustainably and make sure that it does what we expect it to do, which is create behaviour change amongst motorists that will be travelling along those roads and wrongly speeding.
Thank you for the policy clarification. Mr. Veers, you want to say something?
Just to clarify the technical detail, I know this was often discussed on Top Gear. Many road safety partnerships who operate speed cameras actually have to subsidise their use. It isn't a cash cow in most areas. Leicestershire's road safety partnership for many years has broken even, sometimes has required supplementing by the authorities that support it. I do like you, I would say, are your concerns if they were for just raising money for raising money's sake. All of any excess funding that is generated has to be spent on road safety. I personally don't mind people who are speeding, who shouldn't be, paying towards road safety initiatives to help them stop doing that. Thank you very much, Mr. Gemmers. Much appreciated. So have I.
I don't think Mr. Jennings has any need to declare a personal interest in these matters. Any further questions or comments on the capital structure of highways and transportation? Can we move on to environment and waste and paragraphs 35 and 36, and will include paragraphs 37 should members wish to raise any points? Any questions or comments? No. Nothing on those matters. In which case, considering the capital programme as a whole, are there any general comments or questions not covered elsewhere that members would wish to raise now?
It's a capital programme.
Very erudite, Mr. Jennings. Thank you.
Can I just ask a
Mr.
question
Bill.
on the capital programme? If the allocation that we're expecting from the Department for Transport doesn't materialise in the way that we hope it will that affect those monies which have been allocated from the capital programme towards the repair and maintenance of highways? Is our general programme in any way challenged through any failure on behalf of the government to supply us with the cash to do the work?
Sorry, can I just clarify? You mean in relation to the local transport plan allocations we get from government for maintenance?
Yes, and of course we use some of that capital money, don't we, to repair the roads?
Yes, we do. In terms of, the only kind of allocation where we think that there could be a difference is the one related to the incentive fund. We are relatively confident, I know we haven't had it in writing from the DFT yet, but we're relatively confident that those indicative allocations there for the first two rows in that table 4 will be will be what we actually receive. The only risk there is that incentive fund element, which is, as I said, we're going through the process. We have to submit in February our assessment, and government will then look at that and review that, and we'll hear whether we achieve band 3 or not. The difference that makes if we didn't achieve that is shown in table 5. So you have a difference there. If we we'll have 715,000 less by 2021-22 to spend on maintenance than if we achieved the level 3 funding. So, those figures there indicate the difference of what we'll be able to secure for that maintenance, that highway maintenance. However, we are hopeful of achieving that band 3.
Thank you. Have we exhausted questions on that report? It would appear so. Thank you very much to officers and lead members for their time this afternoon. Thank you. Can we now move on to item 8 on the agenda, which is the Community Bus Partnership Review. This report is set out on your agenda pack, pages 43 to 102. And I understand that the Assistant Director of Highways and Transportation, Ian Veers, will present this report. So, Ian, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. The purpose of the report is to advise members of the Scrutiny Committee of the findings of the operational review that's been undertaken, the authority's current position on the operation of community bus partnerships, seek comments on this report ready to go to, included in a report to Cabinet on the 9th of March, and inform the committee of work on the development of a new passenger transport policy against which, if implemented, community bus partnerships will be reviewed. Well, we've already had quite a bit of discussion about that already today. At its meeting, I'll just talk you through some of the history because some of the newer members may not recall, but this committee and others have been very involved in this over the last 4 to 5 years. At its meeting on the 13th of September, Cabinet resolved to adopt a new supported bus policy, and that says para 3, page 43, and it's also included in Appendix A, page 57. In May 2014, Cabinet resolved, following consideration of the ENT Scrutiny Panel, recommendations in particular relating to the establishment of 4 community bus partnerships, as per Appendix B, page 59. The community bus partnership concept derives from the successful community rail partnerships and was new to Leicestershire at that time, but these have been established across other parts of the country. A community bus partnership basically focuses on a specific bus route and working together with partners with the aim to improve the bus service with the objectives of increased ridership and to make the service more viable. One scrutiny panel recommendation was, should there not be sufficient growth to justify continuing subsidy within the existing resource, then the fallback position would be reverted to. This, in these 4 cases, would be the provision of demand-responsive transport. The partnerships were created in 2015 and facilitated by the Rural Communities Council, funded by part by an officer from Leicestershire County Council. Officers of the County Council dedicated to each route, and the bus companies themselves. The routes were the Service 7 Ashby to Nuneaton route, as detailed in Para 16, page 45. Service 55 to 56, Melton to Grantham, Para 21, page 46. Service 113, Melton to Oakham, paragraph 24 to page 47. At this point, I would say I have received an email from Mr. Orson, who declared that he'd read the report and had no further comments to make. He wished that to be made known to the committee. And finally, Service 129, Ashby to Loughborough, which is detailed in Para 27, page 47. The interesting things I'd point out to start with on those 2 routes, the Service 113, Melton to Oakham, actually has a subsidy per passenger head at the moment of £15.54 per head, whereas the Service 129 Ashby to Loughborough has a subsidy of £2 per head, which can show the difference in value for money for providing those transport needs. A review has been undertaken and a report produced by the Rural Communities Council, as Appendix D, page 65, you have a full copy of the report, to see if their increased patronage and a reduction in subsidy has been achieved, and also looking at how the partnership principles have been followed and views of the partners and users to help inform lessons learned for the future. Interesting, we also undertook surveys of all of these routes and the other 29 routes that we currently subsidise as well at the back end of last year, finding that the majority of the users on the subsidised routes were over 60, retired, and often used the routes for shopping, which will help us inform future policy development. The review has established that there is no conclusive evidence over the 3 years of the operation of the community bus partnerships approach achieves the original objective, i.e. more passengers, less subsidy. Other than the 129 service, which increased passenger numbers, but this was due to a commercial change early on in the area where another bus route was taken away by a commercial provider, the route was diverted onto that route and it increased its passenger numbers by picking up those commercial area routes. Finally, I would say work to develop a new passenger transport policy is currently being undertaken following the decisions as outlined in page 52, paragraph 46 to 49. This sets out following February 2017's full council decision where it was announced that the MTFS saving was going, but a review for value for money would still be undertaken. This has led to the development, ongoing work of a new passenger transport policy. This will be detailed in the Cabinet report on the 9th of March, along with the findings of the Community Bus Partnership report. And if approved for consultation, an extensive consultation process then will begin involving all of the communities, and part of that consultation will be to bring a report back to members here for consideration. To conclude, in order for the community bus partnerships to be fully assessed, as they are at the moment, it has been agreed that an operational decision was taken to extend all the contracts to June 2019. This is so if we were to review the community bus partnerships now and a new passenger transport policy was developed in the next 12 months, then the decisions taken could not be reflected in that. Therefore, along with all of the other supported bus networks, all contracts have been extended to June 2019 when it is felt a new passenger transport policy will have been approved and any amended contract arrangements could be brought in. Any questions, Chair?
Thank you, Ian. Members, over to you. Any questions or comments? Mr. Poland.
Thank you again, Chair. Just a quick question, really. I guess it's a question of fact. I notice, obviously, 2 of these services have destinations that are in other counties, Oakham and Grantham. Do those other counties contribute in any way to the subsidisation of those services?
No, not at present. We do have routes where we do cross-fund, such as the routes out to Oakham, but in these cases, those routes were the ones that the majority of our residents were looking to travel to those areas, so those are the routes we continue to subsidise. Obviously, lots of routes travel in and out of the city, other parts of the county, Nottingham, Derby, and passenger transport policy must be developed to reflect that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bolter.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I've sat on 2 of these panels over the last 15 years or so. Mr. Jennings has also joined me on many occasions. It's very exciting, yes. It's like the Forth Bridge.
There's 2 of them.
However, I think if we're going to do this, we need to take everything into account. The RT we've already mentioned as being an alternative, but have we involved the voluntary car schemes in the past in these items? Because, well, in my district, the voluntary car scheme is up and running quite reasonably well. They're struggling, of course, to find drivers, as all voluntary organisations do, but it's all taken into account that could also be a help to us to provide transport in these less populated areas where transport is difficult.
Yes, Ian.
Thank you, Chair. I welcome those comments, Mr. Bolter. I think, first of all, what we have to establish through the consultation, and we've discussed this part here, is what is essential need. We will then go into, and how will that be met? And I'm glad that you've raised there are other forms of transport apart from a bus. The passenger transport policy should call on many different modes because people will have in many different areas different needs and different solutions, as we've heard when we've been discussing special education needs. Wheels to work is one of the areas, car sharing, walking, cycling, community bus partnerships, community transport will all be areas that we'll look at. We have done extensive best practice in looking across the country to see what works well elsewhere, to almost have a suite of offers that communities may wish to take up and we may wish to fund if it meets what we're trying to achieve under the passenger transport policy. I would say the only thing we would try and do is how do we meet people's needs in the most commercially viable way if possible to start with, and if not, as the provider of last resort, how can we do that for the best value for money? But nothing has been determined yet on what it should be, and I welcome those comments.
Thank you. Any other questions? Mr. Hunt.
As a leisure cyclist, he says, I know a lot of these villages actually, because they're on quite quiet roads and they're pleasant to cycle through. What occurs to me, two things really. One is, I couldn't find it, I may have missed it. Is there a consideration of fares and income on these from the passengers? The other one's about sort of hub and spoke, where many of these villages that I know are quite near existing bus routes, but not near enough to be able to walk to, clearly. I assume that we'll be thinking of those kind of alternative alternative provision, so you can get from Pickwell to your nearest main route. And just a personal thing here, really, I always felt that main bus stops in the wilds of Leicestershire should have secure cycle parking facilities, so that you, as an over 60 retired shopper, one can cycle from the village to the bus route, leave your bike securely there, come back, and so on. Quite useful in the summer. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. Ian, have those points been addressed?
Yes, they will be. One of the concepts you're referring to there, Max, is the total transport concept, whereby people can be taken so they can join other commercial services, and how you facilitate that. Technology will play a bigger and bigger part in matching people to journeys, so that will be an exciting new area we can explore. And on a personal note, yes, I've also advocated cycle parking, as you often get in Holland, so you can bike to your local bus stop and then go further. I think the appetite for the British public is not quite there yet, but I will continue to advocate it, and we will see how well it's used. Thank you.
Thank you. Anecdotally, I can just relate that I do know of one parish council that has made money available to build a shelter for mobility scooters. Very close to a bus stop, and that is done through a parish council near to yourself, Max, in Charnwood. So I'll tell you all about that later, and if Ian's interested, I'll let him know. Any further questions or comments? In that case, I have 4 questions. What I'll do, and they're all sort of related, I'll ask all 4 together, if I may, and let you tick them off, because I think you can do it all in one go. The first point I wanted to make is that we've got 33 supported routes in the county, and not all of them are community bus partnerships. How does one of those become a community bus partnership? And does it help improve the service in any way, either commercially or through support? The second question is this. When a commercial route is cut or removed, what consultations occur with the affected residents and the service providers, both the existing one for the continuation or potential other providers to take over from the existing provider's withdrawal? And question 3 is, how can the times and routes of replacement provision be adjusted in the light of operational experience? And finally, there's been some talk in both of the papers this afternoon regarding essential needs. What's the county's... I know there isn't an official definition of essential needs. What's the county's definition of essential needs, and is that to be reviewed any time in the near future? Did you catch all those, Ian? I'll keep an eye on you.
I did, thank you, Mr. Chair. So nice to get interesting questions at the end of the day. I'll start off from the front. As you say, there are 33 supported bus routes currently in Leicestershire, and it's a number that's growing all the time at the moment as the face of the commercial market is changing. So we are seeing an upward pressure on this area across budgets. As I said in the report, there are 4 community bus partnerships, and this was a trial, and unfortunately the conclusion of the report was it really didn't make any difference to the patronage numbers, and it actually says in the report that it was felt if they'd been operated as a supported contract, it would have made no difference. It tends to find that the interests of the groups wavers off, they come down to a very small core, and a number of the community bus partnerships have come back to us and now said, we'd like to try something different. So if a community came forward after we've adopted a new passenger transport policy and said, we'd like to do this, we wouldn't rule it out, but we know an awful lot more about what it would achieve, we'd probably be a little challenging back on, is that what you really want to do, and how would you like to achieve it, but never rule anything out. Did that answer question 1? Thank you. Okay. Okay, down to when we have... Normally, we receive 56 days' notice from a bus operator that they may wish to change or amend a route. Obviously, that's not much time in which to respond to make transport provision. I have to say, as some councillors may know, we sometimes receive an hour or so's notice if a route goes into receivership, and we have to respond very quickly to try and replace. But normally we receive 50 days notice. What we tend to do, we immediately alert the local members on that route that there is a change of foot, so they are aware. What we then look to do is work with local providers, existing routes, understanding the services that were provided before. Remember, these are all commercial routes, so we will not have passenger data. We have to get all of that to then try and design the passenger transport of last resort, because that's the provider we are, that can meet some of the needs. I have to say, the expectation of the public in this environment then is for many of those people who may or may not have used the bus service before is to expect a Rolls-Royce service to meet all of their needs and often looks more like a taxi. What we will provide is the bare essential that can be delivered within the current environment. So that could be diverting of another commercial route, which we have to let a contract for. It could be commissioning a dedicated contract itself, or provided demand-responsive transport. All of that work, trying to get that done and then communicate it out within 56 days is quite challenging. We always then take a report on the changes to the director in consultation with the lead member, which in this case would be Pam Posnett, to discuss the outcomes of the work we've got. Usually this comes to the point within the last couple of weeks, so we can then have a decision on what we wish to propose, which we then communicate out and put in place. There was very little time to actually do consultations with the local public on their needs and service. We based that on what was currently being provided. I am pleased to say, though, that once we've got that in place, we always welcome feedback, and whether it be demand-responsive transport or the bus service itself, if it's not meeting need, people have comments to make on that, they can send those back to us. Sometimes we can change the days of the routes for demand-responsive transport. I can think of a case where doctors' surgeries, it wasn't quite meeting from one village to another. We were able to alter that from the feedback. Through the customer service centre, they'll be fed into the team that monitors the contract. I would say, though, with a word of caution, what people's expectations are and what we can actually afford and provide with the current service. If it costs over £100,000 to provide one bus, our ability to actually fund more is very limited. So that's question 2. Time and... replace... Times and routes. I covered that one as well, didn't I? I got two for one there. That was really good. Okay, and the definition of essential need. If you turn to Appendix A, page 57 of the reports on the Community Bus Partnership, the actual definition that we use for essential need at the moment is declared there, which basically says essential transport needs of residents are defined as follows: all subject to a test around value for money, shopping and personal business, healthcare, social activity and well-being, work. I could probably think of most things that I do that would fit into one of those and then say they're essential. I think what we will have to do as part of our emerging passenger transport policy and a redefinition of looking at that essential need is define what do those actually mean and what should the public purse, as a measure of last resort, be providing, and what can it afford to provide in the most economical way. But that's the current, and I've got to say it's pretty universal across those authorities who haven't taken more stringent policies so far. But we will see what occurs. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. You did say in your answer that there would be a policy review coming up. Can you give me the timetables of that review and the opportunity that members of the public will have to have an input into that review?
I'm sure some of the members who've been around this loop, as they said a few more times, will know it better than I do. We are looking to go to the 9th of March Cabinet with a draft policy, asking for permission to start consultation. From March then onwards through to at least June, we'll be undertaking consultation with the public, councils, bus companies and various other. We will then, as part of that consultation, be bringing a full report to this committee for your considerations. All of those consultation responses then, if felt appropriate, will then be taken back to Cabinet in the autumn for approval of a new policy. If that policy is approved, we then have time to then start implementing new arrangements for different parts of Leicestershire, depending on what the policy says and the need that's been designed.
Thank you. Very full answers, Ian. Thank you very much. Members, that's brought discussions on this item to a close. It only remains for me to remind you of the date of our next meeting, which is Thursday, the 1st of March, St David's Day, at 2 p.m. Please make a note in your diaries. And the final item is to take items decided as we would take as urgent earlier on. We didn't decide to take any, so the meeting is closed. Thank you very much for your inputs. Thank you for your contributions, and good afternoon.